So there I was, Ambassador Jake Murphy, standing on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base, watching the most pretentious spacecraft in the galaxy descend like a glittering Christmas ornament having an identity crisis. The crystalline Empire's royal transport looked exactly like what you'd expect from a civilization that named itself after fancy rocks, all sparkles and unnecessary angles. Out stepped Prince Zephyron, who managed to make walking down a ramp look like he was personally offended by gravity. His sister, Princess Valara, followed with the kind of expression you'd expect from someone who just discovered their champagne had been replaced with tap water. Both of them had that particular shade of blue skin that screamed "I'm better than you" in 17 different languages. "Welcome to Earth, Your Highnesses," I said, extending my hand in what I thought was a perfectly reasonable greeting. Zephyron stared at my outstretched hand like I'd just offered him a live snake. "How primitive," he muttered, his voice carrying that special kind of disdain usually reserved for finding hair in your soup. "Valara, observe how they attempt physical contact as a form of communication. Fascinating in its crudeness." Valara tilted her head, studying my hand with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly disgusting specimen. "Brother, their customs are even more barbaric than the reports suggested. Look how they thrust their appendages at strangers. No ceremony, no proper acknowledgement of status hierarchies." I slowly lowered my hand, reminding myself that starting an interstellar incident over a handshake probably wasn't the best career move. "Perhaps we could proceed to the welcoming ceremony?" "Oh yes," Zephyron said, clapping his hands together in a way that somehow managed to sound condescending. "We're quite eager to document your quaint traditions for our cultural assessment report." As we walked toward the waiting motorcade, I couldn't help but notice how they whispered and giggled at everything. The honor guard standing at attention? Rigid posturing, according to Valara. The American flag flying overhead? Primitive territorial markings, per Zephyron's expert analysis. When we reached the cars, Zephyron actually gasped. "They still use ground-based transportation." "Valara, document this. Wheels, sister." "They still use wheels." I climbed into the limo, already calculating how many diplomatic phrases I knew for "please stop being insufferable." The next 3 days were a masterclass in how to make a human ambassador question every life choice that led to this moment. These two walking jewelry displays had turned cultural observation into competitive insulting, and honestly, they were winning. At the White House State Dinner, Zephyron took one look at the formal table setting and announced, "Multiple eating implements." How inefficient. Our people evolved beyond such crude tool dependency millennia ago. He then proceeded to eat soup with his fingers, which I'm pretty sure was intentional. Valara, not to be outdone, but spent the entire evening explaining to anyone within earshot why human music was rhythmically primitive and lacked the crystalline harmonic frequencies that marked true civilization. She said this while a world-renowned orchestra played Beethoven's Ninth. Beethoven. The aliens were insulting Beethoven. The wedding we attended in Georgetown was apparently an inefficient bonding ritual lacking proper genetic compatibility assessments. The birthday party for the senator's daughter was a celebration of cellular degradation. They even managed to turn a baseball game into a dissertation on humanity's obsession with circular object displacement activities. "You see, Ambassador Murphy," Zephyron explained as we watched the 7th inning stretch, "your species hasn't evolved beyond the need for competitive physical displays. It's quite telling about your developmental stage." I nodded politely while mentally composing increasingly creative responses involving where they could stick their cultural assessment. But it was Valara who really pushed me over the edge during our visit to the Smithsonian. Standing in front of the Hope Diamond, she actually yawned. "How quaint that they display such common minerals as treasures." "Brother, their technological limitations are almost endearing." "Indeed," Zephyron agreed, examining a display about human space exploration. "Look, they're still proud of reaching their own moon. We had interstellar travel when our civilization was younger than their recorded history." That's when my aide, Kevin, rushed over with news that would change everything. Ambassador, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we just received word. General Rodriguez passed away this morning. The alien's head swiveled toward us with predatory interest. A death ceremony. Valara exclaimed, practically bouncing with excitement. Brother, we must observe their primitive mourning rituals. Zephyron nodded eagerly. Yes, this will provide excellent material for our report on their underdeveloped emotional responses to biological termination. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. General Patricia Iron Pat Rodriguez wasn't just any military leader, she was a legend. 2 tours in Afghanistan, architect of 3 successful peacekeeping missions, and the kind of person who sent handwritten notes to the families of every soldier under her command. Your Highnesses, I said carefully, this is a very solemn occasion for us. Oh, I'm sure it is, Valara said with the kind of smile that made you want to check your wallet. We'll be sure to document all the theatrical displays of grief. If I thought the aliens were insufferable before, their excited anticipation of a human funeral reached new levels of obnoxious. They spent the morning before the ceremony practically vibrating with anthropological glee. Based on our research, Zephyron announced over breakfast, consulting what looked like a holographic tablet, we should expect excessive emotional displays, possible ritual scarification, and perhaps even ceremonial combat over the deceased's possessions. Valara nodded sagely. The report suggests they may attempt to preserve the corpse through crude chemical processes. Barbaric, but fascinating from a xenological perspective. I set down my coffee cup a little harder than necessary. General Rodriguez will be buried with full military honors. This is one of our most dignified ceremonies. Dignified, Valara laughed, a sound like wind chimes being strangled. Brother, they probably don't even have proper grief modulators or emotional dampening fields. We'll witness raw, unfiltered sorrow. How primitive. It will be educational, Zephyron agreed. I'm particularly curious about their burial practices. Do they still put the dead in the ground? How wonderfully medieval. As we drove to Arlington National Cemetery, they kept up a running commentary about everything they saw. The dress uniforms were unnecessarily ornate. The gathered crowd was inefficiently large for a single biological termination event. The solemn expressions on people's faces were poorly controlled emotional displays. Ambassador, Valara said as we approached the cemetery, do try not to let their primitive grief responses affect you too severely. We understand your species hasn't developed proper emotional regulation. I wanted to tell her exactly where she could regulate her emotions, but instead I focused on the scene ahead of us. Hundreds of people had gathered, military personnel, government officials, but also ordinary citizens. People who had never met General Rodriguez but understood what she represented. The aliens, of course, completely missed the significance. Look at the crowd size, Zephyron mused. Clearly they don't understand efficient resource allocation for mortality events. And the elaborate preparations, Valara added, watching as the honor guard took their positions. All this ceremony for a single terminated biological unit. How wasteful. I watched a young soldier carefully adjust the flag over the casket, his movements precise despite the tears in his eyes. Another stood at perfect attention even though his shoulders shook with suppressed grief. Your Highnesses, I said quietly, you might want to prepare your cultural report differently than you expected. They exchanged those insufferable looks again. Oh, Ambassador, Valara said patronizingly, we've studied dozens of primitive species. We know exactly what to expect. The first sign that the aliens had miscalculated came when the honor guard began their approach. 6 soldiers, moving in perfect synchronization, carrying the flag-draped casket with a precision that spoke of countless hours of practice and infinite respect. Zephyron and Valara had positioned themselves to get the best view of what they expected to be a chaotic display of human emotionalism. Instead, they found themselves watching something else entirely. The silence was the first thing that seemed to unsettle them. Hundreds of people, standing in perfect quiet as the honor guard processed down the ceremonial path. No wailing, no dramatic displays, just a profound collective reverence that seemed to press against the air itself. "Where are the emotional outbursts?" Valara whispered, her earlier confidence wavering slightly. The chaplain began to speak, his words carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. He talked about service, about sacrifice, about a life spent in dedication to something larger than oneself. The aliens had prepared for primitive howling and chest beating. They weren't prepared for dignity. General Rodriguez's daughter, a Marine captain herself, stood at attention throughout the entire service. Tears tracked down her face, but she never moved, never broke position. Beside her, her mother held a folded program with hands that shook only slightly. "This isn't," Zephyron started, then stopped. His holographic note-taking device remained untouched in his hands. The honor guard executed a rifle salute with movements so precise they seemed choreographed by the universe itself. The sound echoed across the cemetery, sharp and final. In the silence that followed, I heard Valara's breath catch. "They're not primitive," she said, so quietly I almost missed it. The boogler stepped forward. I'd heard taps played at dozens of military funerals, but today, with these two aliens witnessing it for the first time, I really listened. 24 notes, each one carrying the weight of loss and honor and remembrance. By the time the final note faded, both aliens were staring at the ceremony with expressions I'd never seen on their faces before. Something that might have been wonder. "Brother," Valara whispered, "what is this?" The flag-folding ceremony began. 13 folds, each one executed with mathematical precision and reverent care. The aliens watched as if hypnotized as the flag transformed from a drape covering the casket into a perfect triangle, every movement a prayer made visible. When the commanding officer knelt and presented the flag to General Rodriguez's widow, his words were simple, "On behalf of a grateful nation." That's when I saw Princess Valara's composure finally crack. Just a little. Just enough. The 21-gun salute shattered the morning air like thunder, and I watched two of the galaxy's most arrogant beings flinch at something far more powerful than sound. Each report seemed to strip away another layer of their superiority complex. The honor guard moved with a precision that would have impressed their own ceremonial units, but there was something else here. Something the aliens were finally beginning to recognize. This wasn't just protocol. This was love made manifest in discipline. General Rodriguez's grandson, maybe 8 years old, stood between his parents in a suit that was probably uncomfortable and shoes that were definitely too tight. But he stood there anyway, because this mattered. Because she mattered. His small hand was pressed over his heart, and his face carried the kind of solemnity that comes from understanding something profound without being able to name it. "The child," Zephyron said, his voice barely audible. He's not afraid." No, he wasn't. None of them were. Hundreds of humans facing the ultimate unknown with nothing but ceremony and shared grief and the unshakable belief that some things, honor, service, love, outlast biology. As the final notes of the ceremony faded, people began to approach the family. Not in the chaotic rush the aliens had expected, but in a quiet, orderly line. Each person offering a few words, a brief touch, a moment of shared sorrow. I watched a 4-star general embrace a private who'd served under Rodriguez in Afghanistan. I watched a Secretary of Defense wait patiently behind a gold-star mother who needed an extra moment to compose herself. I watched the rigid hierarchy of power dissolve into something simpler and infinitely more complex, a community bound by shared loss and mutual respect. "This is impossible," Valara breathed. "Where are the status displays, the territorial assertions, the competition for social position?" She was watching a billionaire defense contractor help an elderly veteran to his seat, and her expression suggested she was witnessing something that violated several laws of physics. Zephyron had gone completely silent, his note-taking device hanging forgotten in his hands. He stared at the ceremony with the intensity of someone trying to solve an equation that kept changing its variables. "They don't need emotional modulators," he said finally. "They don't need dampening fields or chemical regulators. They just choose to feel this way." The casket was lowered into the ground with the same careful reverence that had marked every moment of the ceremony. People began to drift away, but slowly, reluctantly, as if leaving might diminish what they'd just witnessed. As we walked back to the cars, I noticed both aliens had become unusually quiet. The cultural superiority, the constant commentary, the insufferable analysis, it had all just stopped. The ride back to Andrews Air Force Base was the quietest hour I'd spent with the royal siblings since their arrival. Zephyron stared out the window like he was seeing Earth for the first time, while Valara kept opening and closing her mouth as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, as we pulled onto the base, she broke the silence. "Ambassador Murphy, we owe you an apology." I nearly choked on my coffee. "I'm sorry, what?" "The funeral," Zephyron said, his voice lacking its usual condescension. "We came here expecting to document primitive rituals performed by an emotionally underdeveloped species. Instead," Valara continued, "we witnessed something our own civilization lost centuries ago when we decided efficiency was more important than whatever that was." I leaned back in my seat, trying to process this development. What you witnessed was a community honoring someone who dedicated her life to protecting others. We call it respect. Respect. Zephyron repeated the word like he was tasting something unfamiliar. "We have protocols for acknowledging hierarchies, but this was different." "It was voluntary," Valara said with something approaching wonder. "No one was forcing them to feel that way. They chose to honor her memory." As we watched their transport being prepared for departure, both aliens seemed reluctant to leave. They stood at the base of their ship's ramp, looking back at the horizon where Arlington Cemetery lay beyond the trees. "Our report," Zephyron said finally, "will recommend that the Crystalline Empire establish formal diplomatic relations with Earth immediately. And we'll suggest," Valara added, "that perhaps our own ceremonial protocols could benefit from consultation with human traditions." I shook hands with both of them, actual handshakes this time, which they executed with the careful attention of people learning a sacred ritual. "Ambassador," Zephyron said as he prepared to board their ship, "what you call primitive emotions, they're not primitive at all, are they?" I smiled. "Your Highness, we've learned that the most advanced civilizations aren't the ones with the best technology. They're the ones that remember why the technology matters in the first place." As their ship lifted off, disappearing into the afternoon sky, I couldn't help but chuckle. They'd come to Earth expecting to document a bunch of emotional primitives stumbling through crude rituals. Instead, they'd gotten a master class in what it means to be human. Sometimes the best victories are the ones where nobody has to fire a shot. Sometimes you win by showing up with nothing but dignity, honor, and the unshakable belief that some things are worth grieving for. General Rodriguez would have appreciated the irony. The woman who'd spent her life defending Earth had managed one final victory, even from beyond the grave. She'd shown two representatives of a galactic empire that humanity's greatest strength wasn't our weapons or our technology. It was our ability to love something more than ourselves. And that, as they say, is how you make aliens reconsider their entire worldview using nothing but a folded flag and 24 notes on a bugle. Not bad for a bunch of primitives.